Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good afternoon. The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has apologised to all patients who've had operations cancelled as the NHS struggles to cope with demand. NHS England is advising hospitals to postpone all non-urgent procedures until the end of this month. Tens of thousands of patients are affected as doctors deal with the traditional winter surge in demand. Well, our senior political correspondent Beth Rigby asked Mr Hunt if the NHS was failing on his watch.
There are real pressures, no question about it, and this is the busiest week of the year for the NHS. And the first thing I want to say is a massive thank you to NHS staff who are working incredibly long hours through the night, beyond the call of duty in every possible way. And it's not just me that's grateful to them, it's the whole country. They are doing an absolutely heroic job. But I think what is different this year compared to last year is that we had a lot of operations cancelled at the last minute. A lot of people were called up the day before their operation and told, I'm sorry, it can't go ahead. And we recognise that it is better if you are unfortunately going to have to cancel or postpone some operations to do it in a planned way. And that's why this year we've decided to take this decision, or this independent panel has decided to take this decision. And that, I think, in the end is better for people, although if you are someone whose operation has been delayed, I don't belittle that for one moment, and indeed I apologise to everyone who that has happened to.
And in terms of the NHS staff, we've had clinicians, nurses, doctors on Sky News this morning saying that they feel ashamed of the lack of care that they are providing for patients in this crisis period. Do you feel ashamed of it when people have their operations cancelled?
It is absolutely not what I want. In July, an independent American think tank called the Commonwealth Fund said the NHS was the best healthcare system in the world, and that is what we're all so proud of in the NHS. And when the standards of care fall below those very high standards, very few other countries, for example, have a 95% target. We do, because we want to promise everyone in the country that in an emergency they'll get treated as quickly as they need to be. But we also have to recognise that we have around 3,000 more people going to our A&Es every single day than we did a year ago. We have an ageing population. There are huge pressures. And in that situation, we want to deal with those pressures in a planned, methodical, thought-through way, which is why we're taking these, reluctantly, but we are taking these very important steps.
Well, Sky senior political correspondent Jason Farrell joins us now from Westminster. It's cold comfort, though, isn't it, Jason, for those who have had their operations cancelled?
Yeah, it is, and it often seems to be that these non-urgent procedures are the things that are being put to one side when there are problems within the NHS. And, you know, whilst Jeremy Hunt there saying that we have the best healthcare service in the world, some of their own consultants and NHS trusts, one particular consultant describing it as third world care, saying that really he's wanting to apologise to patients for the way in which they're unable to treat them, and the fact that A&E wards are currently at full capacity has meant that they've had to take this action, this quite drastic action, to actually postpone operations. He's saying that they're trying to do it in a controlled way rather than an ad hoc way, but that really is out of necessity, and some say that this could have been foreseen. Certainly for quite some time now there's been talk about a 30 billion shortfall in NHS funding by 2020-2021. The National Institute for Economic and Social Research said this back in May, but that was also looking at, it has to be said, all of the manifestos of the party at the time of the snap election, saying that if any one of those parties had got elected, none of them were promising enough money for the NHS. Now, we saw in August queues for non-urgent treatment had passed 4 million. So it is the non-urgent treatment that does seem to be getting hit all the time by these lack of funds. Let's hear what Theresa May had to say.
Well, first of all, can I say a huge thank you to NHS staff for their hard work. They work hard and do a fantastic job for us day in and day out all year round. But obviously, when there are extra pressures in winter, they're doing a fantastic job, and their dedication is ensuring that people are getting treatment that they need. The NHS has been better prepared for this winter than ever before. We have put extra funding in. There are more beds available across the system. We've reduced the number of delayed discharges of elderly people who would otherwise have been in NHS beds rather than in social care. But I recognise that for those people who've had their operations postponed, this is disappointing, it's frustrating, but we will ensure that those operations are put back as soon as possible. And once again, I say the NHS staff are doing a fantastic job, and I'm going to get the opportunity personally tomorrow to thank them.
Now, there was another £354 million investment promised in the last budget, as well as £1 billion extra funding for the NHS, but some have argued that that's not enough. John Appleby from the Nuffield Trust said after that, he's the chief economist there, said after that that the big question emerging from the last budget was in terms of waiting lists for routine operations like hip and knee replacements, how far are they allowed to grow in order to preserve and improve some services like the A&E and cancer care. And I think that is a really poignant question, because I think we're starting to see the answer to that question, that these routine operations are what suffers when the NHS appears to hit these crisis points.
OK, Jason, thanks very much. Well, the Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth, joins us from Leicester this afternoon. Good to talk to you, Mr Ashworth. We heard there the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, talking about why they've decided to take these steps in January, because previously people had their operations cancelled at the last minute. 3,000 more attendances at A&E this year than the same time last year. Isn't this the government being prudent, putting in steps so that people don't get their operations cancelled the day before?
Well, I can understand why NHS England have had to make this drastic decision, but we shouldn't be in this situation. We've been warning the government for months that they were ill-prepared for this winter. As far back as September, we were urging the government to allocate an extra £500 million for the NHS this winter. Back in November, we were warning the government that they haven't done enough to encourage people to take out flu vaccinations, and of course now we've got very severe warnings about flu. But this is all in the context of 8 years now of severe underfunding of our NHS, cuts to much community health provision like walk-in centres closing. We've lost 14,000 beds in our hospitals. We've got vacancies for 100,000 staff, and we've seen quite severe cuts to social care. And the consequence of all those cuts is what we're seeing today. So the blame for what is happening lays at the door of Downing Street, I'm afraid.
Well, Theresa May has pointed out today that £340 million in the budget was allocated to the NHS. We've seen other big chunks of money. More beds are now available across the system this year than there were last year, and they've had a lot more success in transferring elderly people who really just need social care into a social care setting and out of hospitals. Is it not that the problem is an increased demand, the extra numbers of people who are coming into the system?
Well, indeed, and we all predicted extra demand on the system. We've all been well aware that we have an ageing population, which is a good thing, of course. It's good that people are living longer, and yet the government have been utterly ill-prepared to deal with those different indicators that we all knew about months, indeed years ago. In terms of the extra money the government say they've put in, well, they only told hospital trusts the week before Christmas how much they were getting. We were saying back in September, put the money in now, not wait until the week before Christmas to tell hospitals how much they may well be getting. And in terms of social care, we've had £6 billion cut from social care over the last 7 years, which means 400,000 very elderly and vulnerable people do not get the care support out in the community that they should be getting. It's why we've got so many elderly people literally trapped in hospitals with nowhere to go because of the cuts in the wider community. Look, and this has been going on now for 7 years. Theresa May has been burying her head in the sand. She's been a senior member of this government and the Prime Minister for 7 years. This cannot continue. The government have to change course, get a grip, and put the NHS on a long-term, sustainable financial footing. Give it the money it needs. This cannot carry on.
Well, The government would say that money for the NHS has been going up year on year. Others would argue that actually more money isn't the solution, that the NHS needs to reorganise. Perhaps there needs to be greater privatisation of some elements of it to allow it to react to market forces. Why are you so confident that simply throwing more and more money at the NHS is actually going to improve the service that it provides?
Well, you don't have to take my word for it. You can take Simon Stevens' word for it. He's the head of the NHS, and he called for an extra $4 billion
to be
for
fair,
2018.
the head of any organisation will always ask for more money,
didn't...
won't they? Sorry, to be fair, John Ashbridge, the head of any organisation would always want more money for his organisation.
Well, you'd have thought that the head of an organisation has a reasonable sense of how much money the organisation needs, and he called for an extra $4 billion. Of course, we didn't get an extra $4 billion in the budget, and he's warned that things like operations, routine operations for things like knee replacements and hip replacements, people are going to have to wait longer and longer, often in agony, in pain and in distress for those types of operations because the NHS isn't getting the funding it needs. You ask, does the NHS need more privatisation? Most certainly not. We need to end the privatisation in the NHS. We've got a crazy situation where Virgin can sue the NHS for not getting a contract, and money that should be going to patient care in Surrey is going to Virgin. So, no, we're going to end privatisation. But actually the big issue is the underfunding, and this sustained underfunding is hitting capacity in the NHS, and that's why we're seeing what we're seeing today.
But do you accept that more money has gone into the NHS in recent years and that it doesn't seem to be helping the situation?
Well, the NHS budget has, of course, increased, but it hasn't increased by nearly enough. Traditionally, the NHS budget would rise by around 4% a year. It's been more or less getting 1% a year, so it's not keeping pace with the demands that are placed upon it. And at the same time, the community health budgets, the public health budgets, which are now administered by local authorities, have been cut back. And of course, social care has been cut back by a considerable number of billions, which is really causing problems for the NHS because, as I say, we've got many elderly and vulnerable people trapped in hospital with nowhere to go in the community because the social care support simply isn't there anymore.
But there isn't an endless pot, is there? And the money has to be found somewhere.
No, absolutely, the money does have to be found somewhere, which is why we were very sceptical about cutting billions from corporation tax or giving £1 billion away in inheritance tax, or perhaps giving £1 billion to the DUP in return for their votes in the Commons voting lobbies. So when the government needs to find money for their own projects, they seem to be able to do it. They just don't seem to be able to find sufficient funding for the NHS.
OK, John Ashworth, Shadow Health Secretary. Good to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us today. Today's main story is the NHS is forced to cancel tens of thousands of operations. Hospitals are being advised to postpone all non-urgent procedures until the end of this month as the NHS struggles to cope with the winter surge. So what is causing this pressure on the NHS? Well, hospitals are seeing high levels of respiratory illness with a limited bed capacity to deal with the surge in demand. There's also a reported increase in flu cases and severity. NHS England's National Emergency Pressure Panel is recommending that all non-urgent surgery be postponed until February, and this includes surgery for joint replacements and hernias. Cancer operations and other time-critical procedures will, though, still go ahead as planned. And it's estimated that up to 55,000 operations are going to be affected overall. The panel is also recommending the sanctions for mixed-sex wards to be temporarily suspended. And the advice for the public is that they should use the NHS responsibly, calling 111 for clinical assessment or seeking advice online or consulting with a pharmacist before going to A&E. So, is the NHS failing? I'm joined now by Kate Andrews, news editor at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Dawn Foster, columnist for The Guardian. Kate, to you first. We've spoken to some doctors today here on Sky News who say they're embarrassed about the state of the NHS at the moment. They have patients piled up on trolleys in corridors. Isn't it clear that the NHS needs more money?
Well, I think it's clear that the NHS is failing, and then the question is, how do you go about addressing that? When you have 50,000 people, it's not a statistic, it's people who are in pain, who are waiting for knee operations and hip operations, and they're being told that they can't have them because the NHS can't cope with the winter flu, you have a very serious problem. In my opinion, the NHS is not underfunded. It actually is higher on average than the average country in the OECD. You do have a record number of funding going to the NHS. What what has changed is that the percentage of growth going towards it year on year has dropped. It's now about 1.2% between 2010 to 2021. It used to be 4% a year. So it's true that less money year on year is going to increase the budget of the NHS, but you do have more money going to the budget than ever before. There are huge efficiency savings to be made. And you can look at countries throughout the world that spend more, like Germany and France, that get better outcomes. But you can also look at countries that spend less or equal to the NHS, like Australia and Iceland, that also get better outcomes. So for me, the funding issue is secondary. We have to think about reforming the system as a whole.
OK. Dawn Foster, do you agree that actually it isn't all about funding?
No, I think in the immediate and short term, what we really need to look at is funding the NHS properly and making sure that people who need operations now, people that need to be in proper beds rather than just in gurneys and corridors, are seen to as quickly as possible. I've got a lot of friends who work in the NHS, and whenever I spoke to them over the Christmas period, when they had 1 day off, 2 days off, they were utterly exhausted. They felt embarrassed at how badly the NHS was coping. But all of them worked extremely hard with the absolutely limited resources. I've got a few health problems myself, and I found that the waiting times have increased and increased. Ever since 2010, I've seen the quality of health for me and all of my friends and deteriorating. And I think that we need to step in now. And we can't keep having an NHS that runs on an absolutely bare bones budget, so that every time, every winter that we have this crisis, which isn't unforeseen, we end up in exactly the same position with ambulances backed up and people knowing that if they go to an A&E, they could be there for hours, and people actually not managing to get GP's appointments so that they get to the point that their respiratory illness is so bad they need to go to A&E.
Kate, it's a refrain we hear a lot, isn't it, that the NHS is run on a shoestring, but it's also run largely on the goodwill of the people who work in it, who work extra hours, they work incredibly hard, often for very little financial reward. You yourself said that although the amount of funding has gone up year on year, it's not keeping pace with inflation, is it? Is that really right, that the government doesn't fund the NHS, it doesn't fund it in line with inflation?
Well, funding is still going up in real terms, but like I said, the same amount isn't being put in as it used to be. So we're still at record numbers of investment, but it's not going up at the same pace. I sympathize with a lot of what Dawn just said, especially about doctors, junior doctors especially, who haven't seen a very big pay raise at all over the past few years. And I'm more than happy to have a conversation about priorities. If we think that the NHS and public sector workers, especially within the NHS, need more funding, then we need to make some tough decisions about where that's coming from. We can't increase the deficit. That is a tax on young people down the road. Money spent is money borrowed that has to be paid back. They're already facing huge financial burdens down the road because of fiscal irresponsibility. That's not an option. We're not going to be able to get much more out of increasing taxes. We're basically at that threshold. So yeah, sure, let's start making some tough decisions and prioritize what we want to prioritize. But again, the NHS is not just all of a sudden doing poorly because of the current government. It's been underperforming for years. It ranks in the bottom third of international health comparisons. This cannot be swept under the rug. Let's have the funding conversation, but it has to be part of a much larger conversation about why countries like France and Germany and Switzerland and Australia and New Zealand and Hong Kong and Singapore are treating their patients and their workers so much better than we do here in the UK.
Dawn, is that a fair point, that it's not all about funding? The NHS perhaps could be run better. We are operating essentially on a system that was created 70 years ago. Do you think that it is time now that the NHS, somebody stood back, took a big look at it and said it needs to change? We should be able to run this organisation on this amount of money to cater for this many people. We need to change the structure.
I think it definitely does need to be changed. I think two big problems were the fact that New Labour brought in huge PFI contracts, which has massively impoverished the NHS for a long period. And then from 2010 onwards, the Conservative government started starving the NHS of funding. So those two things have really, caused huge problems for the NHS. I think both those need to change, and Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour government, and the Labour shadow cabinet have actually, put forward those arguments. But I think that we need to look at what is happening right now. And if you look at the UK, actually in certain areas, life expectancy is declining, health is massively decreasing. And to actually stop that from, increasing now, what we need to do is look at a huge injection of funding to stop this crisis happening every single year, to raise life expectancy and stop the decline we've seen since 2010, and really invest in people's health. As Kate and you both said, we have an incredible NHS workforce who work for far less than they should, purely through their own goodwill. And I think that all we can do at this point is fund them properly and make sure that the nation's health is really held in the greatest esteem extreme. And I don't see that from Jeremy Hunt, and I don't see that from Theresa May at the moment.
Kate, Labour famously said government was all about education, education, education. But, you know, there is the other saying that you don't have anything if you don't have your health. Shouldn't the nation's health be the #1 priority of a government, Kate? And therefore, shouldn't that be what the government spends more money on than say, defence?
Health should absolutely be the priority. This is one of my biggest frustrations about the way that we treat the NHS. You can't criticize the sacred cow. And so, as you pointed out, a system that hasn't been reformed since it started is now crippling. You know, every other country apart from the United States looked at the principle of universal access to healthcare and said, we like that, the UK has come up with a great thing. But except for Ireland, every country has gone about adopting that differently because the strict single-payer system of the NHS is a failure. And it's especially a failure when you have changing demographics like we do and when you have a population that's increasing. And nobody seems to be willing to address this. I mean, Dawn keeps calling for more funding. Where's the money coming from? I completely agree that this current government is outrageous, saying that they're disappointed that 50,000 people have been put out of operations. You're in charge. Make the changes. Look at reform. But I fear that the opposition government would be just as pitiful, frankly, when it comes to making the reforms that patients really need. We need patient-centric systems. We need a system that cares about how much our doctors and nurses are working and how much they're getting paid. The NHS is not fit for purpose in 2017. So if you want to put health at the forefront, if you want to make that initiative, which I completely agree with, look to France and look to Germany. Until we're willing to open our eyes to the reality of what's happening in the NHS, patients are going to suffer.
Dawn, Kate made the point that the money has to come from somewhere. Where do you think it should come from if you want to give a huge amount more to the NHS?
I think it can come from a number of places. I disagree with Kate that we absolutely have to, decrease the deficit now. I think you can borrow to spend. I think that the economy is very elastic and you can move things around a lot of ways. There are lots and lots of areas I think that we are overspending. One thing I mentioned earlier is PFI, and Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Shadow Cabinet have said that they would like to see an end to PFI. I think PFI was one of the biggest mistakes of New Labour in the NHS, and I think that actually when you look at what the Conservatives are doing, they're continuing that. I think we need privatisation out of the NHS. All it's doing is massively impoverishing.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dawn, but do you not think there's a potential that it could make some elements of it more efficient?
No, I don't. I think that all it's done in the long term is tie up the NHS in lots and lots of different, very, very high interest loans that have massively, massively complicated things. I think if we get back to basics and look at making sure that the funding that goes into the NHS goes to care and goes to workers instead of going to very, very complex financial systems, then we could avoid this and we wouldn't need to increase it massively. I think PFI is a really, really good way for the financial services to cream off some money under the guise of efficiencies. When if you actually look what happens, especially in some hospitals that are failing because of this, it massively complicates care. I think we need to get back to basics, and I think we need to increase funding and make sure that funding goes to care and goes to doctors and therefore moves on into making sure that all of us have better health.
OK, I think you probably both agree on that final point. Very good to talk to you both. Kate Andrews and Dawn Foster, thank you both very much.
The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has apologised to patients after hospitals were told to delay tens of thousands of non-urgent operations and outpatient appointments in England this month so the health service can cope with the winter pressures. The Prime Minister acknowledged the decision was disappointing and frustrating for all those affected, but she insisted that the NHS was better prepared for this winter than ever before. Many senior doctors, though, have warned that they're struggling to cope. Labour says the NHS is in crisis. Our health editor Hugh Pym has the latest.
Cancelled operations bring new worries for patients like Anna. She's due to have facial reconstruction surgery after nerve damage. There's an outpatient appointment next week, but that's in doubt, and her hopes of the operation happening in January seem likely to be dashed.
It's kind of impacting my life quite a bit. I mean, I drool quite a lot now, which is quite frustrating. And, and I am very uncomfortable, really, with it. And I think it will improve my quality of life quite a lot to have it.
Today, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, pushed for explanations, said sorry to those patients who were affected.
I want to apologise for the fact that we have had, regrettably, to postpone a number of operations. We're trying to do it differently this year. Last year we cancelled a lot of operations at the very last minute, so people got a call the day before to say their operation wasn't going ahead. That is obviously very undesirable, so we want to do it in a much more planned way.
Surely the NHS can't be running properly under your government if you have to cancel a month's worth of operations and outpatients appointments.
Well, I think it's important to recognise that these pressures are pressures that we're seeing all over the United Kingdom, in Scotland and Wales, where the NHS is being run by different political parties.
The Prime Minister said she recognised that for people who'd had their operations postponed, it was disappointing and frustrating. She said NHS staff were doing a fantastic job. NHS England and the government say extensive preparations for winter were carried out across the system. But if that's the case, the question is, why were official instructions on cancelling non-urgent operations extended this week? Here at St Mary's Hospital in West London, they've planned to treat more people without needing overnight stays. The idea is to keep beds free for those who really need them. But it's been tougher than they expected because patients this year are sicker than they were.
The numbers are largely the same, but the intensity of the illnesses we've been seeing this year actually is very, very significant. And we've really had to work very hard to find appropriate places to nurse patients who've got really very serious conditions. And I think a number of things play into this. The weather, as we know, we're beginning to see an increase in the number of flu cases, and all of that builds up to quite a problem for us on some days.
Throughout the day, there were reports across the country of the highest level of stress at hospitals. Nottingham's Queen's Medical Centre asked patients to avoid A&E because of sheer weight of numbers. Southend and Plymouth were also said to be under extreme pressure.
When you've got ambulances backed up outside hospitals, you've got hospitals saying they're overcrowded, when you've got people waiting on trolleys for hours and hours and hours, it is a crisis, and it's because of 7 years of underfunding and cuts to our NHS and the government simply burying their head in the sand.
NHS Scotland said there'd been a 20% increase in A&E visits before Christmas. The Lanarkshire Health Board has for now cancelled non-urgent procedures. The Welsh Government said thousands of hours had been lost for ambulance crews waiting to hand over patients at hospitals. It's early in the new year and the NHS across the UK is already struggling, and it's patients who are enduring the consequences. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
It is, of course, the frontline staff who will have to bear the brunt of the decision by NHS England to postpone thousands of operations. But they aren't the cause of it, and today the government issued a full apology for making patients wait for elective surgery. The Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt admitted it was unacceptable and said, "I apologise wholeheartedly for that." But top doctors are warning more than stopgap measures are needed to ease the current strain on the emergency departments. Let's get more now from our political correspondent, Libby Vina.
For Anne Webb, the NHS winter crisis is all too real. She was expecting to undergo reconstructive surgery after cancer this week, but the operation was cancelled at the last minute.
I was due to go in yesterday, and I got a phone call about 3:45 on the Monday afternoon saying, due to bed shortage, they're absolutely chock-a-block that it had to be delayed. I'm not sure when I will be rescheduled, obviously due to the fact it's still ongoing.
The pressures in the system mean hospitals across England have been putting out the message, if it's not an emergency, stay away. This consultant says he's never seen anything like it in 17 years of experience.
It means patients in corridors, it means that ambulances are waiting outside hospitals for a long time, waiting to offload. We have frail elderly patients on trolleys waiting in corridors, long waits to be seen, and then when they've been seen, if they need to be admitted to hospital, even longer waits afterwards.
Hospitals in England have been advised to cancel all non-urgent operations and inpatient treatments until at least the end of January. Up to 55,000 operations are expected to be postponed, including hip and knee replacements. Some hospitals have been forced to treat patients in corridors. NHS England has also lifted the ban on putting men and women in shared wards. The Prime Minister was hoping to highlight help for home buyers today. Inevitably, she was asked about the state of the NHS.
I recognise that for those people who've had their operations postponed, this is disappointing, it's frustrating, but we will ensure that those operations are put back as soon as possible.
But there's a consensus among those working in the health service that the government is simply asking too much of the NHS and more resources are needed. Today, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, hinted a funding review might be necessary. Meanwhile, he says he hopes patients can be given as much notice as possible.
We are thinking ahead, and we want to also give hospitals the time and space to plan better. And so that's why yesterday this new panel, the National Emergency Pressures Panel, made the decision that they did, and this will allow us to cope with the pressures in a much more planned and methodical way.
You thanked staff, but are you going to apologise to patients?
Of course, because even though I think we are better prepared this year, even though we're treating many more patients every day, around 5,000 more operations every day than just 5 years ago, if yours was the hip replacement that was cancelled, and you're going to have to wait an extra month for that, you could be in pain, and that is unacceptable, and I apologise wholeheartedly for that.
Serious operations will still go ahead, accounting for more than 90% of procedures, but that will be of little comfort to those who've had their treatment postponed. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.
It is not just England where the NHS is under pressure. Figures out today show emergency departments in Scottish hospitals are also battling a big surge in demand. In the week leading up to Christmas, the number of people attending accident and emergency rose by a fifth, that's 20%, on the same week the previous year, to more than 26,500. Part of the cause is seasonal illness, with GPs reporting consultations for flu and other respiratory infections rose by a quarter. Our Scotland correspondent Peter Smith has the picture.
At Wishaw General Hospital, staff are feeling the festive strain. It's so stretched here right now. Those who would normally be doing office jobs are being redeployed into the hospital.
We've taken a number of managerial and admin staff and we've asked them to give a hand, and we've redeployed them to our 3 acute sites, and they're just giving an extra pair of hands on the sites, and it's making a big difference.
Why are staff numbers so stretched at this point in time?
I think it's the fact that the hospitals are full.
The office staff will be helping out as cleaners and porters, the idea being they'll free up medical staff on frontline services. NHS Lanarkshire is using this strategy at its 3 main hospitals because they are simply inundated, the situation made worse by a new outbreak.
There's quite a lot of influenza, proper influenza around, but there's also the normal winter vomiting bug as well. And you know, we've got older people too who are more vulnerable and frail, and when they get one of these bugs, that can take them a bit longer to recover from it. So lengths of stay in hospital can increase.
The Scottish Government says £22 million was invested to cope with the extra winter burden this year, but A&E waiting times are still well short of their target. Still, waiting times have generally been better in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. This patient received a new heart valve and told me his life was saved by swift treatment.
The doctors have seen me right away, the physiotherapists have seen me right away, and anybody at all need to see. It's only a matter of days between phoning them and getting an appointment.
You've not had long waiting times?
No, not at all.
No complaints with the NHS in Scotland?
Not at all, no.
The Health Board here admits it's taking extraordinary measures to cope this winter by drafting in help wherever they can get it. But if it works, it could be a strategy others will be asked to follow. Peter Smith, ITV News, Lanarkshire.
In Northern Ireland, senior health officials are openly admitting emergency departments are in crisis. They say unprecedented numbers of people are seeking treatment, 250 over the last 2 nights alone at one single hospital in County Armagh. Doctors have been speaking of scenes of chaos with patients having to wait while lying on floors.
I think it's very detrimental for morale, both of medical colleagues and nursing colleagues who have to deliver care in these circumstances. It's very challenging. We have to thank them for their resilience to date, and doubtlessly we will be relying on it going forward to treat the patients with the care and dignity that they require and deserve.
Well, to complete this pretty sobering picture of emergency care across the UK, A&E services in Wales were described today as a battlefield. According to one senior figure, patient safety there is being compromised daily. Let's go to our health correspondent Emily Morgan in Newport. Emily, what have you been finding out today?
Well, I think when you hear that the Vice President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine is comparing A&E departments in Wales to a battlefield, you know that there is a problem. He says there simply aren't the staff to treat patients, or indeed the beds to treat them on in A&E. And of course the figures speak for themselves. Here in Wales, 95% of patients in A&E are supposed to be seen and discharged within 4 hours, but ITV News research has found that on New Year's Day, one hospital only managed to see 48% of patients within that time, and it's a similar picture across other hospitals. And another startling figure, around 2,000 ambulance hours have been lost over the past 7 days due to delays at hospitals, and it's delays in hospitals that's having such a knock-on effect for ambulances who then simply can't get out to other emergencies.
When an ambulance arrives at hospital, if there is no space to immediately hand the patient over into, a clinician, usually a doctor from the hospital, will come out and assess the patient. So all the patients are being assessed on arrival, but some patients do remain on the ambulance for some time before being able to be safely handed over. And that obviously has an effect on our ability to respond to the next emergency.
Well, I've been here at the Royal Gwent Hospital in Newport for much of the day. Yesterday it was escalated to a level 4, which means pressure on the system is extreme. That has now been reduced to a level 3, and the NHS Confederation here in Wales say hospitals are generally coping. I think many patients won't agree tonight.
OK, Emily Morgan in Newport, thank you.
Staff on the NHS frontline have gone public with their stress and frustration at the state of accident and emergency departments across the country. And the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, today apologised to patients in England whose operations or appointments have been cancelled in a bid to ease pressure on beds. We'll be hearing more from Mr Hunt in a moment, but first, Jane Death has this report.
Over the last few days, a cry for help has gone up from England's hospitals. Angry, frightened tweets from the front line. Today, we asked doctors to tell it like it is.
Almost all the areas that can possibly be used in the department are full of patients, and there are patients waiting for beds on wards.
The service is in crisis. We're stretched up to just about our bare limits at the moment. We're being overwhelmed in A&E departments by the sheer numbers of people.
Doctors have been talking about numbers of hours waiting. In one case, 12 hours to be seen in A&E. In another, 22 hours to get a bed on a ward. Addenbrooke's in Cambridge is just one hospital asking all but the most sick to stay away. The reason? More people struck down with flu and not enough beds. Addenbrooke's has taken the decision to cancel routine and non-urgent surgery for today. But across England, as hospitals' condition went from serious but stable to critical, NHS England is urging trusts to consider cancelling all planned operations until February. Cancer patients will still get surgery, but up to 55,000 procedures could be put off. Yet the Royal College of Emergency Medicine says the bed situation is so dire it won't make much difference. And it warns the frail patients waiting on trolleys for hours are more likely to die.
Ambulances are waiting outside hospitals for a long time, waiting to offload. We have frail elderly patients on trolleys, waiting in corridors, long waits to be seen, and then when they've been seen, if they need to be admitted to hospital, even longer waits afterwards. Certainly we know that crowding like this is associated with much less good care, and there will be some avoidable deaths as a result of this.
In the last week, some 19 trusts have been on black alert, which means patient care and safety could be compromised. In Birmingham, Dennis Kelly's kidney stones operation today was cancelled for the second time.
It's very, very, very painful. And actually, on one occasion, prior to my first appointment, I had to go to A&E at 2 o'clock in the morning to get some treatment because it was just very, very painful.
NHS England admits hospitals haven't been under this much pressure for 20 years, but the Prime Minister says there is no crisis.
We have put extra funding in, there are more beds available across the system, we've reduced the number of delayed discharges of elderly people who would otherwise have been in NHS beds rather than in social care. But I recognise that for those people who've had their operations postponed, this is disappointing, it's frustrating, but we will ensure that those operations are put back as soon as possible.
Scotland's feeling the pressure too. Its hospitals failing to meet their waiting time targets in December. It's been the same in Wales, emergency medicine doctors there saying it feels like a battleground. In England, an extra £300 million to see the NHS through this winter hasn't been enough to give thousands of patients the operations they've been waiting for.
Jane Death reporting. Well, now, earlier I spoke to the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. I started by asking him what he'd say to one accident and emergency consultant in Stoke who has publicly apologised to patients for the third world conditions at his hospital.
Well, what I would say to all NHS staff, first of all, a massive thank you, not just from me, but from the whole country, because they are working under extraordinary pressure. And it makes me very proud, actually, to see how extraordinary the NHS is in what is our busiest week of the year. Stoke is one of the most distressed hospitals that we have in the NHS. And I don't think that what's been happening there is acceptable. And we're doing everything we can to support the staff at Stoke. It's not their fault, but there have been some problems in that system. But actually this week there are problems everywhere because this is a very, very busy week. And we have prepared, I think, better than in previous years. But that doesn't...
not well enough.
Well, there are some differences. We planned for an increase in activity this year, but I mean, the North East Ambulance Service talked about a 30% increase, and we planned on the basis of the increases we've had in previous years, but some of the spikes have been higher. We've also had an uptick in flu. We're not sure yet whether it's going to be an epidemic like they had in Australia, but definitely been
pre-budget, pre the moment when you asked Mr. Hammond for more money, and you asked for more money than he gave you.
Well, I did particularly, there's a bigger issue about NHS funding, which we can come to, but I did particularly ask him for some support for this winter, and he found £337 million, which I think was more than the NHS was expecting.
But it came late.
Well, we've used it to very good effect. I mean, I think one of the biggest pressures that you have at this time of year is beds, and this week, because of that money, we'll have an extra 1,100 beds in service across the NHS. But I think there is a broader issue about NHS funding because of the ageing population that we need to address as a country as we come to the end of the 5-year plan that we're currently in.
But in a sense, you've known that all along. For 3 years, this moment of crisis has been advertised very widely, that in fact, by 2018, unless there was a profound change in the way in which the NHS was funded, you wouldn't make it past a crisis, and you haven't. You've had to postpone all these operations. What do you say to an elderly woman who has a hip operation and is now going to be probably immobilised by the fact that she can't have the operation?
Well, I'm the Health Secretary. It's my job to make sure that that lady gets her operation in time, and this January a number of people will have their operations postponed. And even though we're doing every day 5,000 more operations than we were when I became Health Secretary, for that particular lady, it is a very, very big deal. She may be in pain, and so I can only apologise to her and to many others in her position.
Why are we staggering from crisis to crisis, when in fact, if you were strategic, you'd say, come on, we really need a 10-year plan. We know what's going to happen in these 10 years. Let's go for it.
Well, that is exactly what I think we do need going forward, but I think it's important...
So that's official. The Secretary of State says we've now got to fund the NHS on a 10-year basis, 10 years by 10 years by 10 years.
We're in the middle of a 5-year programme of reform being led by Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, and I think as we come to the end of that programme, we do need to look forward, and I would argue that we should look forward not just 5 years, but I think we do need to look forward longer than that, because it takes 7 years to train a doctor. But I think it's important to remember that what we're going through at the moment in this our busiest week is the same winter pressures that they had in Australia when they had their winter, that they had last year in France when they had 1 million people with flu. And we're not unique in having particular pressures around this time of year. When it comes to the long-term funding issues, of course they matter. But I think the record of since 2010 is really a story of two halves. I think in the first half of that period, we had the financial crisis, we had the risk of a financial meltdown, there was a very challenging period of austerity. But in the second half of that period, we have seen significant extra sums of money coming into the NHS.
But clearly not enough. If you could ask the Chancellor for what you need, what would you ask for?
Well, I don't think the Chancellor would like me to answer that question on your show, John, but what I would say is...
it's not entirely clear that he's really very sympathetic to your plight.
Well, I think you have to look at what the Chancellor delivered in the budget we just had, which was an extra £2.8 billion.
Which was probably about £1.8 billion less than you asked for.
But I think to answer the question, you have to
you
go
don't
back...
deny it.
Well, to answer your question properly, you have to go back to that doctor in Stoke and what is on his mind and the minds of doctors and nurses across the NHS is that there is too much pressure year in, year out. And what you need, and the prior question to funding, is what staffing levels do you need?
What one senses is that Brexit is immobilising you all, and you seem unable to focus on what is really happening to the population of this country.
Well, I totally disagree with that. In the period I've been Health Secretary, we actually have 40,000 more doctors, nurses and clinicians, which is a very big expansion, and I think there's a real recognition of the importance of the NHS. It is true that demand has gone up by faster than resources, but it's also true that if you look at the public service that's been the biggest winner since the economy has got on its feet 2-3 years ago, it's been the NHS.
But somebody hasn't got the sums right yet, and the people who are suffering are the people waiting up to 12 hours. We have reports of people waiting in A&E to be attended to. And what do you say to them?
Well, what I say to them is that, first of all, when we don't deliver the high standards of care that we aspire to, that is my responsibility. And as I said before, I apologise unreservedly where we don't get it right. But what I also say is that we are one of the only countries in the world that has a 95% standard for A&E. Other countries like Canada...
Well, at the moment, it seems the Royal College of Emergency Medicine is saying 40 to 50% of patients are now waiting more than the 4 hours that you've stipulated. I mean, that's and when the target is 95%.
Well, compared to 7 years ago, we're actually treating
hang on, that's no comfort to the people who are waiting.
No, but let me say, we are treating 3,000 more people within the 4-hour standard. So we're seeing a big expansion of our capacity. But do we need more people? Do we need more doctors? Do we need more nurses? Of course we do. And the way we do that, because we have a taxpayer-funded system, is we have to have a strong economy that generates the tax revenues. But if I just give you one decision made by Theresa May, which shows our commitment to the NHS in the long term. In her time as Prime Minister, we've seen the number of doctor training places and nurse training places increased by 1/4, the biggest increase in the history of the NHS. The only long-term solution is to have the numbers of doctors and nurses that we need. Now, unfortunately, it does take 7 years to train a doctor, 3 years to train a nurse. So we're going to have to ask staff in the NHS to bear with us as we train those extra numbers of doctors and nurses. But what do we want? Well, you know, an American think tank, the Commonwealth Fund, rated the NHS as the best healthcare system in the world. That's what we want as a government, and that's the long-term commitment that we are making with these decisions.
Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, from Birmingham now, I'm joined by the Labour MP for Wolverhampton South West, Eleanor Smith, an NHS theatre nurse for 35 years before she stood in last year's general election. With me is Junior Dr Dagan Lonsdale and Kate Andrews from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Dagan Lonsdale first. When you hear a consultant talking about third world conditions, is that an exaggeration, or is that what you're seeing on the ground?
Well, look, I can't speak for the hospital he works in. I'm not sure what I describe in my hospital is third world conditions, but certainly in the 10 years that I've worked in the NHS, things are as tough as I have seen them. For me, working as a junior doctor in a hospital, when we have more patients than we are used to, more medical patients, the ones I look after, the real concern is that somewhere in the hospital there's a patient that has been missed off a list or has not been flagged to me who is unwell, and that I might come around the corner and find them, or perhaps might not.
So you're worried about that on a daily basis?
Not only on a daily basis, but when I go home at night, I worry about the things I might have done or might not have done, the decisions I've made, which are now more rushed because there is more work to do. And that's echoed by the stories we're seeing up and down the country.
But then Theresa May said that the NHS is better prepared than ever, and that actually they're planning well because they're cancelling operations with a bit more notice, rather than doing it last minute.
Well, I think this is a tremendous piece of PR by the government, and today's work by by Jeremy Hunt is a real piece of showmanship from him, because not only is this situation predictable, it was entirely predicted by junior doctors, by senior doctors, by nurses, by healthcare commentators like the King's Fund. And so for Jeremy Hunt to come out and use the tremendous doublespeak of saying, aren't we marvellous, we're planning brilliantly by cancelling a month's worth, 1/12 of elective operations in the NHS, is quite frankly farcical. This is a man who champions himself as the patient safety czar, the guy who's going to make the NHS the safest healthcare system in the world. And yet he is proud to stand up and say he's cancelling a month's worth of operations. I don't want his thanks. I don't want to be proud of me. I want him to run a healthcare system properly, and he is quite clearly failing in that, and that is his primary responsibility.
Well, let me put that to you, Kate Andrews. A pretty savage indictment there, really.
Yeah, I actually agree with most of what you've said. I do think it's quite shocking that when you have 50,000 operations cancelled, these are patients, people who are in pain, who need these surgeries. For the health secretary or the prime minister to come out and say that they're frustrated, disappointed, a bit sorry, is simply not good enough. They're the ones in charge.
So surely what is good enough is to spend the billions more that are needed to keep pace with an ageing population.
Well, this is the problem that we have, is where is that money going to come from? Now, we might say that we want to put more money into the NHS, into increasing the funds for public sector workers, but we're going to have to make some tough choices. Increasing the deficit is not an option. That is money spent and borrowed that has to be paid back, that's going to fall on the younger generations. For me, funding is important, and we can have those conversations, but it's a secondary issue.
Well, let me bring in Eleanor Smith now. Do you acknowledge, Eleanor Smith, that this isn't just about money, that there are countries around the world, Australia and Iceland, for example, that spend roughly the same and get the same results? Better results, sorry.
Sorry, I can just about hear you.
Is this about money at the end of the day?
It is about resources, which is what we need. It's about money. As I says, I actually worked in the health service for 40 years before I became an MP. And for many a time, in the last 7 years, we were actually they denied us the resources that we needed, the money, they cut the funds, hence the crisis that we're in now. And it is a crisis. We can't say it isn't. That's what it is. You have now patients that are going to have to wait. I mean, they've put them off for a month. How long? And what about the others that were waiting before that? It's just going to extend.
But your spending plans that you put forward at the last election would still lead to a £7 billion black hole in the budget. So it's not just about money, is it? It's about making some tough choices, as Kate Andrews was saying.
When you say tough choices, what tough choices are we talking about?
Well, let me bounce that back to Kate Andrews. What do you mean by tough choices?
Well, I mean that money doesn't grow on trees. There's no magic money tree.
Oh, please don't say that.
Well, there isn't. And I think if we want to have a serious talk about spending more money on the NHS, we can. But are we willing to cut HS2? Are we willing to go into other budgets in order to find that money? But like I was saying,
let me get Eleanor to answer that question. Ella Smith.
At this moment in time, the reason why we haven't caught up, the reason why we're in the crisis that we're in, is because our budgets were cut and we were expected to make savings. When you make savings on something like the NHS, which requires of growing funds, that's why we're in the position that we're in. So you talk about tough choices. Yes, there are tough choices that's got to be made. But at the same time, we're talking about people's health. That, to me, is more priority than any tough choices you're talking about. And I just caught I'm sorry, but I didn't hear it all, but I just caught a bit when you said about the younger generation. This is about the younger generation. I have a granddaughter, and I want my granddaughter to have an NHS. And the way that the funding at the moment by the present government, we will have nothing. And people will be actually crying out because we not have the services that we should have.
Kate Andrews?
Look, fundamentally, when Jeremy Hunt in his interview was talking about the Commonwealth Fund study, he said that the UK has been ranked the #1 system for healthcare. This is simply not the case. It's the outlier study in all the studies you can find. And even in that one study, in the health outcomes category for patients, the NHS did not rank first. It ranked 10th out of 11. Overall, the NHS tends to rank in the bottom 3rd internationally for healthcare outcomes. I'm not talking about looking to the US system. I'm not talking about slashing budgets. All I'm saying is, why don't we look to countries like Switzerland and Germany and Australia and Iceland, which actually spend the same, if not less, than the NHS and get better healthcare outcomes, and see what they're doing there?
We had better outcomes when the Labour was in government. We spent more on GDP on the health service than what this government came in, and the first thing they did was cut the budget. Please look at that. We can't, at the end of the day, a health service which changes all the time, which requires funding, needs funding, doesn't need a little bit of funding, needs a lot more funding. That's what we need to do.
Okay,
if you want a future NHS, a future for our generations to come, we really need to look and see how much we need to spend.
Let me just put this back to Dagan, because what we're really talking about here is social care, isn't it? Because that's where the big cuts have come. The Tories came up with a plan to deal with social care, and many people think that's why they lost the election, because it wasn't popular.
Well, yes, that's the perennial problem we have, that any time someone suggests a radical plan for restructuring the way social or healthcare is funded, then there is a problem at the ballot box. And so I think it's really important that we do have a conversation about the funds that go to the NHS, but it's important to put that into context. This is the most tight squeeze on the NHS budget in its history. That is a fact. It is undeniable. It is then absolutely laughable for the Health Secretary to sit in your studio and say, well, now we need a funding solution. Of course we need a funding solution, because it has been deliberately stripped back throughout the course of this government. We have 15,000 fewer hospital beds. We've got $6 billion out of social care. We have a problem with not being able to get patients into hospital. We have a problem with patients not being able to get out of hospital. It's a crisis created by this government that now must be held to account. And it is just simply not good enough for us to say that, well, we'll make a solution in 10 years' time.
Dagan Lonsdale, Kate Andrews and Eleanor Smith, thank you very much for joining me.
At least 17 hospital trusts are on the highest state of alert tonight, as well as 2 ambulance services in England. NHS doctors, consultants, emergency practitioners and nurses have spoken of the impossible conditions in which they're being asked to work, some calling it the most intense strain in their professional lives. We'll hear later from the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and Chris Cook will be here to explain why the service is coming under such pressure. But first, let's hear from those on the front line themselves.
When patients have their appointments or their operation cancelled, they may come back into the surgery a few weeks later because their symptoms have got worse, so they may be asking us for additional pain relief or some other way of helping them to manage their symptoms until they're rebooked. Another thing that we see is that the hospital administration teams are so thinly staffed now that patients are told they'll receive another appointment in the post, and then that may not happen. So they quite often have to try and phone the hospital. They leave phone messages. They may leave 2 or 3 phone messages but not have a reply back. So they come into us to ask us to help them reschedule their appointment. We're also getting an increase in winter viruses in children. We're just starting to see an increase in people with flu. So there are many different ways in which the winter pressures do affect us in general practice.
It means a complete loss of dignity for patients. I think that's the most striking thing that I've seen. Right at this moment, there'll be hundreds of patients being cared for in corridors. That means makeshift screens being pulled around them for them to try and go to the toilet. Their results, their screaming, their pain, their tears, all being heard by everyone around them. It's just an impossible place and way to treat patients and to look after people. Mistakes are going to happen. People are going to be treated inadequately, and all we can do is just say sorry and apologise, and that's not good enough.
Between the Christmas and New Year period, during an emergency surgery, I saw a very elderly lady who I felt that we couldn't manage in general practice. So I felt that she needed to go to A&E, and so instantly the anxiety within myself starts, because the patient maybe doesn't want to go into A&E, which you can understand, and you don't want this elderly person to potentially go on their own up to a very busy A&E department, which I know that they are always busy and overstretched. And then the ongoing consequence of whether she is admitted and the pressure that that adds onto the hospital, or whether she's maybe given some treatment and then sent back home, but she's home alone and therefore is she going to be able to get any sort of temporary services while she recuperates at home? So it's one of the dilemmas we face on a daily basis, not just over the sort of winter periods where obviously the demand increases, but I think throughout the year.
When an elective operation is cancelled, it has a lot of implications on everyone. In a hospital environment, a person going in for an elective operation will probably have to have a pre-operative assessment. They will need to have a pre-planned program if they need to be got fit before an operation. And so therefore, cancelling an operation means that everything will have to be repeated, but it also has significant impact on the individual. So taking a young person, for example, who say has a scar that needs revising and also has a lot of psychosocial effects related to that scar, it therefore means that they will have to put their life on hold most probably for 1 to 2 months, because they have planned for their life to move on after they've had their operation, and that has an impact for both young and old.
Well, that was just some of those working with patients in the NHS every day. And for transparency, we should mention that alongside his day job, one of the contributors, Dr. Am Incorrigible, has previously campaigned against the government on health matters and is a member of the Labour Party. Now, Chris Cook is our policy editor, and he has a chance to explain why the service is under such a strain now. Just give us, if you like, Chris, the big picture first of all.
So the thing to really get your head around is the idea that this isn't a story about the NHS doing less than it used to. It's about the NHS doing more than ever, but not keeping up with this wave of demand. So we have this graph here, which shows hospital admissions going back to the late 2000s under Gordon Brown. And you can see it went from about 1 million hospital admissions a quarter to about 1.4 million. That's the gap you can see at the side there. So that's a 40% rise, roughly, since Gordon Brown left office. The thing is, hospitals, and not just hospitals, social care system and GPs, haven't been able to keep up in recent years with this rising tide. They've not been able to build in the capacity they need. And for example, we can show you another graph showing you why. If you look at the amount the hospitals have been spending in the last 4 years on things like new buildings, renovating existing buildings and new equipment, there have been big declines over the last 4 years. So 10% down on new build, about 20% down on improving existing buildings, about 50% down on new equipment. Gosh. We're not putting money into expanding the pipeline, not in hospitals, not in social care, not in GPs, so that we can cope with this ever-rising demand.
So when you put it like this, it looks as if it's all about money. Is it all about money?
So money is a necessary but not sufficient part of the answer to the problems in the NHS. The thing is, you have to remember that there are things like recruitment, which have lead times. We have a problem at the moment getting and keeping staff, not least because of the referendum result, which means it's been particularly hard to recruit and retain people from the EU. Also, even if you put money into capital, to building all of that equipment, to putting in that stuff, you also have to fund the people to work in it. You can't just build the kit and then not staff it. Right. So you have to have money in the right places for the right stuff as well. And that's all a challenge, and it all has lead times.
Chris, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and I asked him if he recognised a national health system in crisis.
I think a crisis is when you have adverse circumstances and you don't have a plan to deal with those challenges. And that's not the case. In fact, the opposite. We have been planning most of the year now for the challenges of winter. We had a very challenging winter last year as well. But are there highly challenging circumstances on the front line? Absolutely. And I think the thing I'd like to say is a very, very big thank you to all NHS staff, not just from me, but from the whole country, because I think we are incredibly proud of the efforts they're going to keep patients safe, working well beyond the call of duty. You're saying a big thank you to NHS staff. They are saying, I'll read out the following: Richard Fawcett, Senior Doctor in Emergency Medicine, I personally apologise to the people of Stoke for the third world conditions. Dr Taj Hassan, President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, we are seeing conditions people have not experienced in their working lives.
Dr. Nick Scriven, President for the Society of Acute Medicine. The position is as bad as I've ever known. Tracy Bullock, another one, Chief Exec of Mid-Cheshire Hospitals, who says, I'm 34 years in and I've never seen anything like this. So shall I ask that again? Is this a crisis?
Well, as I say, I don't dispute their experiences. It is very, very tough on the front line. But if you just look at what we're coping with this year, compared to a year ago, around 3,000 more people going every single day to our A&E departments.
You're happy to say that we plan to cancel 55,000 operations or postpone. You're happy to say that that was part of the plan?
Let me explain exactly what the plan was. So this time last year, what we ended up doing, because we had extreme pressures, is cancelling a lot of operations the day before.
But just because you're not cancelling them with 24 hours notice doesn't mean that this is a step in the right direction. This means you have a systemic crisis. You have a massive chronic gap between your needs and your resources. You recognise that, don't you?
Well, I think it's really, there is a resources issue which we can talk about, but it's really important to recognise that this time of year creates pressures in health systems all over the world. So they had a terrible winter in Australia, which was our summer.
But it's not just about this time of year, is it, Secretary? Let me tell you, 3 years ago, as you well know, in October of 2014, 200,000 people were in that group category waiting more than 18 weeks for treatment. You will know well that by the end of last year, that number had doubled, 400,000 people. So this is not something that just happens over Christmas or over winter. This is the direction the NHS is heading in.
Well, let's look at the longer term performance, because in the 5 years that I've been Health Secretary, we have an NHS that is doing 5,000 more operations every single day. The accident and emergency departments in our country are seeing 2,000 more people every single day within the 4-hour target. We have more doctors, more nurses, and an independent report published in the middle of last year said that in most major disease categories, outcomes have dramatically improved. So
you were hitting your A&E targets in July of 2015, 95% of patients dealt with within 4 hours. You haven't met that target since 2015. Is that wrong?
No, that is correct. But that is not the entire measure of the performance of the healthcare system. At the same time,
does the target not matter? Tell me if these targets are out of date and we can get rid of them.
Of course it matters, but in that period, there are 7,000 people alive today who wouldn't be alive if we'd had the cancer survival rates of 2012. So you have to
set these targets and you're missing them. If that was the last time you reached the target, which was July 2015, where are we now with that?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where we are. We are treating more people than we ever have in our history within the 4-hour target.
But with the 95%, because you used to publish this data on a weekly basis and now we don't see it, you will know that figure. What is that figure now as a percentage?
No, we publish it on a monthly basis, but let's just look at the last published data. Next week we'll have the data for the whole of December. But if you look at the November data, let's just look at specifically the issue you raise of A&E. The data from November shows that every day, in fact, the number of people we're treating compared to 7 years earlier is 5,000 more within the 4-hour target. It also shows that more than half the hospitals in the NHS are performing better on A&E than a year previously. It also shows that
those numbers don't match. I'm just asking for the percentage so that we can let the public understand how they compare. Why won't you tell me what the number is as a percentage? It's not my target, it's your own target.
Because we don't have a number to publish. There's no number that I'm sitting on that I'm not telling you. As you know, what happens is that the data is collected across the system once a month. And that data is then validated and it'll be published next week, and I don't know what that number will be, just as you don't know what that number.
So are you happy to tell these people, whether it's Richard Fawcett, Taj Hassan, Nick Scriven, Tracy Bullock, chief execs, experts in their field, that everything is going according to plan? That you are reaching targets, that there is not a crisis, that there is no systemic problem with the way the NHS is funded or is working right now? Can you tell that to frontline staff?
You're putting words into my mouth, and I haven't said that.
I'm asking you that question.
Exactly. Well, you're putting words into my mouth. What I'm telling you is there is extreme pressure on the front line, and we are incredibly grateful for the hard work that those doctors and nurses and many other people are doing.
And you're asking for that money from the Prime Minister, from the Chancellor, are you?
I'm asking for money, and I've been given money, and that's why in the last budget I got an extra £2.8 billion. We are going to need more money going forward, of course, but let me say this. It isn't just about money, it's also about manpower.
You won't have the manpower if people think that they're in a crisis and they're not able to work in the conditions that they're being given.
Well, I'll tell you how we get the manpower, Emily. We get the manpower by training more doctors and nurses. It is going to take time for those, it takes 7 years to train a doctor, 3 years to train a nurse.
You've got somebody who said they've been working in this for 34 years. What do you say? Bye-bye to them because they say it's the worst crisis they've ever seen?
I say to them, thank you for the amazing work you're doing. Please bear with us. We are trying as hard as we can to train up more doctors and nurses to get into the system.
And if voters in England or patients who've had their operations put back or frontline staff who have expressed their frustrations need to find somebody accountable for what they are facing right now, who is that person? Is it you or is it Simon Stevens of NHS England?
Well, ultimately, I am accountable for the treatment of every patient in the NHS. I'm the Health Secretary. And to people who've had their operations delayed because of the winter pressures that we're now facing, I apologise because I recognise that it is a very, very big deal if you need a hip replaced and you're having to wait longer.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you.